The G7, European Union and Australia have put a price cap on Russian oil. This latest sanction against Moscow over the conflict in Ukraine means they will no longer pay more than $60 a barrel, regardless of the market value. Perhaps even more damaging for Russia is that insurance firms or shipping companies that do not respect the price cap will be prevented from working in the European Union or G7 countries. So, will this measure do anything to force Russia to rethink its actions in Ukraine? Or will Moscow simply find a way around it? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. The idea of the price cap on Russia's oil is to restrict the revenues that Moscow makes, while at the same time keeping Russian crude on the market by paying just enough to make it worthwhile to keep them producing. Moscow is yet to fully respond to the measure, but has insisted that it will not sell to anyone who complies with the $60 cap. One side effect is that countries like India and China are likely to benefit, because if they're suddenly the only buyers of Russian oil, they'll probably get it at a deep discount, and that's already happening. So, how serious is this for Russia really? And more importantly, can it actually work? Joining us to discuss this in London, we have Domitilla Sagramoso, who's a senior lecturer in security and development at the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. Meanwhile, we also have Marco Gasic, who's an international affairs commentator. And from Bern in Switzerland, we have Cornelia Meyer, who's a macroeconomist, energy expert, and the chief executive of Meyer Resources. Well, Domitilla, if I can start off with you, I suppose the first question that I have to ask you is, will this policy work? Can it work? Why hasn't Russia simply turned around and said, well, if you don't want to sell to us at the market price, that's fine, we won't sell to you?
Well, this policy there are two aspects. On the one hand, there is an embargo on the purchase of Russian oil, which doesn't come through pipelines, so which is sort of seaborne. And that, I think, can be implemented more easily because it's more sort of straightforward. And in that respect, the United States, the UK, and also many European countries have stopped slowly or have reduced the purchases of Russian oil. At the same time, some European countries will still buy Russian oil that comes through pipelines. I think what is more complex is implementation of this price cap, because it requires really a very close monitoring of the whole logistical system and the way that sort of these oil resources are transported. So I think that Russia in particular is already trying to find ways around it. It's not very clear if it's going to work. The problem is related to replacing European shipping mechanisms or systems or ships that carry the oil, as well as finding alternative insurance companies. So they are trying to set up this new mechanism. I think we have to wait and see if it's going to work. The Indians are not going to accept this sort of price cap. But what is interesting is that the cap is placed not extremely low, which is what some European countries wanted. It is placed at $60 per barrel, and I think that is more or less around what the prices were when these decisions were taken. Of course, this can
hold on. We'll talk about the price cap and the level in just a second. But at the moment, I'm kind of interested in everyone's takes in a free market. Will a price cap work in the first place? Cornelia, if I can ask you, do you think a price cap will work? Will it be very complicated? Is the jury still out?
I think the jury is still out, and I think it may not work for several reasons. One, China, India, and Turkey have been quite clear that they will not work with a price cap because they have larger geopolitical issues, which is their relationship with Moscow. But what that means is the Europeans, as was said before, will no longer buy Russian crude. So it's now diverted to China, to India, to Turkey, and to some other countries, which gives that smaller pool of buyers a huge leverage. And when you look at the discounts, the deep discounts at which Russian crude is sold into China and India, it is well below the $60. The other thing is the insurance side. You have, if you adhere to the price cap, you can get Western shipping, Western insurance, Western finance. The Russians have been buying what I would call a shadow fleet of about, last take, 103 tankers. The Chinese tin pots, the smaller refineries, have their tankers. They're old tankers, not necessarily IMO compliant, International Shipping Standard compliant. And the Russians have their own reinsurance company, which they use, but it's never as good as the club of the Lloyd's Club of Insurance that we have. So the result will be maritime security is not that high, and environmentally it's not as good as it was before.
Marco, I have a feeling you're not going to be in favor of the price cap at all. Do you think this policy will work?
I think the policy is a red herring, really. I mean, the $60 nature of the policy is the red herring. The real question here is who decides? Who's going to decide how much they? If you're selling a house and your buyer tells you how much he's going to pay for it and no more than that, and that's a bit of a diktat. And this is a similar attempt at diktat by a West, which I'm afraid is rather used to coming out with diktats. I mean, OPEC, for its part, is keen on stability in the oil market. That's part of its mission statement. But the West here has really rocked the boat and is making a bid for power over commodity prices. I believe it's starting with oil. If it manages with Russia, then OPEC will be next, which is why I think that OPEC, among others, will not be keen on this return to neo-colonialism, forcing of price models on vassal states that the West has de facto moved into now. So if, however, the Russians were to lose this battle about their own sovereignty over their own prices, then OPEC would be next. And once oil was sorted out, gas would be the next on the list, followed by other commodities. Because once you accept a master-servant relationship in global politics, as the West is trying to impose, then you will have to live by the consequences. And I think the rest of the world does not want to do so, which is why I think this whole policy will rebound on the West in the geopolitical space. It will force other countries into the arms of China, where Saudi Arabia already signed, Saudi Arabia already hosted Xi Jinping with a 29 billion deal yesterday. And that's, I think, only the beginning. We have BRICS orientation. We have alternatives to the West now, which we didn't have before.
Well, Domitilla, let's get back to your earlier point. You mentioned where the price cap is. This $60 price cap, currently the oil price is oscillating between about $75 and $90 a barrel. $60 is only just below that. Poland, quite famously, was saying, well, hang on a second, if we're going to have a price cap, let's have a proper price cap, put it in at $30 a barrel. What's your take on where they have chosen to put the level?
I think that the level of the cap shows sort of the effort to sort of find a way whereby you kind of try to control the price, but at the same time you know the price that Russia sells the oil, but at the same time you try to ensure that there is a flow of oil into the market. I think that's what the Americans were trying to do. When there was talk initially that Europeans could start imposing this sort of these restrictions, so the Americans were very keen to have this price fluctuation, so that you can play around it and make sure that there isn't such a low cap that it really reduces the amount of oil in the market. So I think that in a way this explains also why Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was not very happy with this decision, because in a way I don't think it's going to have a very immediate impact. And to me, the problem is much more related to sort of the logistic transport, which could be resolved in some way. And I think we're going to find many alternative ways, as was mentioned by Cornelia, and probably sort of almost like a shadowy market emerging. But we haven't seen really a very, very significant increase in oil prices as a result of it, because this cap is not so low. And I think that European and Americans are going to work together to try to make sure that, it doesn't go too low. So I think that these measures, have an impact, but, they also, are intended not to completely disrupt, the oil market. I mean, they're really intended. I mean, there is a logic behind it. I mean, we have a very serious war in Europe, and we don't want to make sure that those who are carrying out with this aggression in Ukraine, are continuing to be able to finance their activities. So I think it is not so much a question about colonialism. It's much more related to the emergency of war that we have in Europe, and a way to try to curb the Russian aggression.
Well, let's talk about, you mentioned there President Zelensky of the Ukraine. Here's what he had to say about the price cap when it came in.
The logic is obvious. If the price limit for Russian oil is $60 instead of, for example, $30, which was voiced in particular by Poland and the Baltic states, then the Russian budget will receive about $100 billion per year. This money will go not only to the war and not only to Russia's further sponsoring of other different terrorist regimes and organizations. This money will also go towards further destabilization of precisely those countries that are now trying to avoid serious decisions.
Those are extremely strong words from Zelensky. You might expect those to be extremely strong words from Zelensky. If the cap is $60 a barrel, though, and other people wanted $30 a barrel, that difference between the $30 and the $60 a barrel, doesn't that just mean that Europe's financing both sides of the war in Ukraine? Isn't that the position they place themselves in?
Well, whatever the figure, the point is the Russians will not allow it to be imposed by an alliance which is designed at their expense. So the Russians would turn down any figure regardless of level almost. The point is, do market forces decide? Do sovereign governments decide on their own resources and leave market forces to take their view? Or does an alliance which is against you decide what you're going to pay? So I do feel that it's not going to happen in any variant. But I mean, the West has been perfectly happy to see, maybe I exaggerate, but the West has been prepared to see Ukraine suffer hugely and grievously, and economically in the long term, it's going to be a very difficult story for Ukraine. President Zelensky, for his part, seems perfectly willing to see the West pay huge amounts for its oil and gas and resources in the name of the war, which seems to be unable to be stopped. So it's not about it's about geopolitics again, and the Western alliance is characterized by a uncaring attitude between its separate components. The US doesn't mind that Europe is on its industrially on its feet, on its knees at the moment now. Because of these high energy prices which are being forced on the situation. It doesn't mind too much that Ukraine is battling to the last Ukrainian, and Zelensky, for his part, doesn't care about the consequences to Europe of that battle continuing. But I think we should all be concerned about this. This is ultimately about a will to power on the part of the Western powers. If we hadn't had that will to power, we wouldn't have had Ukraine divided in the first place by the West insisting that it had to choose one way or the other. So it is about colonialism. It is about power. It's not about some kind of justified punishment for Russia. It's about continuing a war which could stop if the parties on both sides were willing to see it stop. I think the Russians would be prepared to negotiate, but I think the platform has to be neutrality for Ukraine as a basis for safety for Ukraine, as a basis for stability for Ukraine, as a basis to end the war and end the energy crisis that we're discussing.
Cornelia, if I can bring you in here. As you've mentioned, the oil market will have to rejig. It will have to readjust as China and India probably buy oil at a steeper discount from Russia, and the European Union can then sit back with a political win and say, well, we put a price cap in place and we're not buying Russian oil. Is it just going to be the case, though, the European Union will be buying Russian oil? It's just going to be buying it through another vendor. It's going to be taking some of this steeply discounted oil off India or China or someone else. Or is that too cynical?
I think that's too cynical, and it may come back in form of products if it goes through a refinery or so. But I think what we have to see is, yes, we have the discounts, but we also have a rearrangement of trade flows. We have now Russian oil going to China and going to India. India has come from nowhere in terms of the buyer of Russian oil to being number 2 buyer within the last 7 months or so. And we will see Europe increasingly buying oil from GCC nations, maybe some from Africa. But what that means is obviously that's longer journeys, by the way, more CO2 emissions, just to bring that in. And these realignment of trade flows always come at a cost. They come in Europe at a cost for refiners. And Marco was right. I mean, the industrial base in Europe is hurting. I talk a lot to people who are invested in steel and all the energy consuming industries in Europe. And they say, look, we can go we can go to America, we can go to Asia. Why would we be here? So it is going to be tough. One last word. OPEC is not a price-setting mechanism. OPEC isn't in its statutes. It says they are trying to ensure that markets are adequately supplied. Just felt I needed to point that out.
Do you think that the oil market will continue to be adequately supplied, though? This is a pretty strong intervention in a market that has historically been very, very tight.
Well, it's a market that's right now quite tight, but you've seen oil prices coming down. All of it depends on whether we are going into a recession. You talk to many of the economists, they say second half of next year, the US will be in a recession, Europe will be in a recession earlier. If we are going into a recession, we consume less oil, we may be fine. It also depends on how quickly China comes out of the anti-COVID-19 measures, which they come out quite rapidly. So yes, we are not that well supplied. OPEC has a spare capacity of about 2 million barrels a day, which is about 2% of global consumption. So it is tight, and we will see some Russian oil not going to the market. You look at the IEA says it's something like 1.3, 1.5 million barrels a day. You look at OPEC, they say it's more between 700 and 800,000 barrels a day. But there will be less oil hitting the market, and that oil may be missed at some stage, which will have an upward price. But then you look at what happened over the last week. After the OPEC meeting, the price shot up, and then it came down again.
Now, the White House press secretary has obviously been grilled on this topic rather extensively. The press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, had this to say.
The goal of the price cap has always been to ensure that discounted Russian oil continues to flow onto global markets. And even as we limit the energy revenue that Russia is using to fund its illegal war in Ukraine, and so we believe that the cap at this level maintains clear incentives for Russia to continue exporting. And so, look, the price will lock in a discount on Russian oil, especially in light of the $100 per barrel they earned just a few months ago, and it can be adjusted over time to prevent Russia from further profiting from its war.
So we were hearing there from the White House press secretary what she thinks of this particular price cap. Domitilla, is the price cap going to be useful, or is it simply political theatre as the oil market simply reshuffles, reorders, the trade balances move around to the rest of the world?
I mean, it may look as political theater, but I think what is interesting to know is where this cap comes from. And this cap was an effort by the United States to make sure that there is, as was mentioned, a continued flow of oil, and that oils do not skyrocket, because this does not help America. The American economy also suffers from inflation if oil prices increase. So, and this also explains why the Americans released oil to the market, to reduce the price. So I think that, this is an effort to make sure that something is done about, the export of Russian oil, which finances the war in Ukraine, which is extremely brutal, and it's really very, very painful for the Ukrainian people. And at the same time, for European security, it's very destabilizing. So it is a way of trying to see if, we can address the question of revenues from the Russian perspective. And these are all actors that were significant buyers of Russian oil. But as was explained by Cornelia, the market's shifted because now Europeans are buying from other sources, including the Middle East. And now the Russian oil is going to China, to India, and to Turkey. So to a certain extent, we're just seeing maybe a reshifting of the markets, but at least a very symbolic position by Europe that they're not going to just sit by and not act when the prices of oil from the Russian side might skyrocket. But it's a very complex mechanism, and I'm not so sure it's going to work very effectively. But it had to address the concerns of those who, like the Poland and the Baltic states, were very concerned about the fact that they are putting a lot of effort into trying to help the Ukrainians to fight this war, and at the same time, there is the Russians keep selling their oil. So this is it's intended as an instrument that could potentially reduce the flow of Russian oil, but that at the same time increases the price. So there is always a catch-22, unfortunately.
Well, Domitilla, you make an interesting point there. Let me play devil's advocate a little bit, slightly contrarian point of view. You mentioned the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and US President Joe Biden's release of oil from that. However, the United States is one of the world's largest oil producers, and if it wanted the oil price down, it could simply produce more oil. And they have chosen for political reasons not to do that. Does that not simply make this a lot of political theatre? Cornelia, if I can address that to you.
Well, I think that it's not that easy because, if you talk Russia, you have Rosneft, which is essentially a Russian state-owned company to a large extent. If you're dealing with GCC, you have ADNOC, you have Aramco. They also, the state plays a big role. In the US, it's private companies, and especially when it goes to shale oil, the mathematics need to work. So it's not just a tap that you can switch on. And I wanted to say one small thing to the release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, the energy minister of Saudi Arabia, in my view, very correctly mentioned at a conference in October in Riyadh and said, when the market gets really tight, you might really you might wish you had thought twice about releasing those strategic petroleum reserves for price reasons.
Well, Marco, if I can put that across to you, what do you make of the US releasing strategic petroleum reserves to try and bring the oil price down to this price cap kind of level when they could simply raise oil output?
Well, I think their problem is in part that also the Russian oil, the Russians specialize in this diesel element of the thing, so that that diesel is the vital thing for trucks, for supply of factories, and therefore for industries across the board in Europe, particularly. So the Americans recently were going to Venezuela to try and persuade them to release their oil, which is a kind of thicker grade, which is more suitable for these kind of purposes. And the Russians are, with the Iranians and Venezuelans, one of the biggest producers. So I think there will be and remain a demand for this Russian oil. It will just be done through intermediaries. The Russians will sell to country X, which will pre-package it and sell it on back to Europe at a higher price. So yes, the Russians will have to discount it, but then Europe will have to pay more for it. And in the middle, the new Asiatic tigers will be raking in the money as a result. So I'm afraid that both Russia will suffer and Europe will suffer, and those in between will benefit. And as far as the insurance question is concerned, I think that the Russians, with their purchase of the oil tankers that Cornelia referred to, will intend to deliver direct to the consumer, no longer just to a port of embarkation, but to the actual final destination, so that the insurance question won't be so important. And at this time of crisis, the carbon outlay won't be so significant to the Russians at all, really. So that's the situation. A little bit complicated, but Russia and Europe will lose and Asia will gain.
Domitilla, on that point that Russia and Europe will lose, you're a specialist in strategic studies. Is Europe not putting itself in a very difficult position here? Because it said, look, we're going to get tough on any country that tries to do an end run around our sanctions. Well, whoops, those countries happen to be two of the world's largest markets, China and India. Is Europe not putting itself strategically in a very dangerous position here?
To a certain extent, but again, because this price cap is not so low, I think a lot will depend on that. I mean, then it might be modified, and I think it's not having an impact as negatively as people were expecting. So very much, a lot depends on this price cap, on the level of this price cap, which can be managed and moved around to suit particular needs. That is specifically on this policy. On the overall policy of Europe, I think that unfortunately, I mean, Europe doesn't have, unfortunately, much of a choice. I mean, Europe is the European Union. It goes all the way to the Baltic states and Poland, Romania, who are on the forefront of this war in Ukraine.
Domitilla Sagramoso, Marco Gasic, Cornelia Meyer, thank you very much for joining me and agreeing to talk about this topic. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just head off to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all of the team here, thank you for watching and goodbye.